21st century Japan resembles 1940s Japan as much as today's Germany resembles the Nazi era. That is, not at all. But the Japanese of the World War II era committed horrible crimes. Facts are facts. Horrible atrocities have occurred in almost every nation and culture in history. They occur most often when ordered and encouraged by the country's leadership. Unfortunately, one of the things that we've learned throughout history is that many people will become absolute brutes and monsters when they're encouraged to do so, or know that they will face no legal consequences for their actions. At least, not from the government. Japan's intriguing history is marked by a unique period of isolation. For centuries, from the early 1600s until the mid-1800s, the island nation remained cut off from the rest of the world, as the ruling shoguns enforced a strict policy of seclusion. Foreigners could only visit a small island near Nagasaki, and Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving. However, this all changed when American naval officer Matthew C. Perry forcefully opened Japan to international trade in 1853-54. When Perry's crew arrived, they were stunned to find a country seemingly trapped in the early 17th century, with outdated architecture, clothing, and weaponry. Around the same time, China was losing its autonomy to European powers. Part of the country was effectively controlled by foreigners, and the Chinese were pressured into signing a series of unequal treaties. These agreements granted favorable trading terms to foreigners, allowing them to amass wealth, while many Chinese suffered. Furthermore, in regions of China known as concessions, Europeans and later Americans were subject to their own laws, even when committing crimes against the Chinese. Determined to avoid a similar fate, the Japanese strategically maneuvered among nations and occasionally used the threat of violent uprisings to resist Western influence. By understanding their own limitations and compromising with the West when necessary, the Japanese pursued two main goals: rapid modernization and preventing Western powers from dominating Japan as they did China. Following a period of internal conflict, Emperor Meiji assumed control of the country, putting an end to the reign of shoguns. Between 1871 and 1905, Japan transformed from a society reminiscent of the 17th century to a contemporary industrial nation with a modern military. Contrary to the expectations of many, except the Japanese themselves, Japan emerged victorious in two wars, against China in 1896 and the Russian Empire in 1905. The defeat of Russia astonished the global community as Japan sought recognition as an equal by the modern Western powers. Regrettably, Japan and the West held divergent worldviews, particularly regarding race and ethnicity. The West, which had long dominated in military prowess, technology, and economics, was hesitant to view the Japanese as equals. This reluctance was partially rooted in racial prejudice and partly in the perception that the Japanese have heavily borrowed from European advancements. The Japanese, however, had witnessed their country's transformation from a primarily agrarian society to an expanding industrial force. They had triumphed over two much larger nations, China, which had historically regarded Japan as an inferior tributary state, and Russia, which had assumed their superior military, naval forces, and soldiers would easily vanquish the Japanese. Unbeknownst to them, Japan's military was more advanced, their soldiers better trained, and their generals more adept. Japan took great pride in their victory over Russia, demonstrating to the world that they were on par with any Western nation. Regrettably, many Japanese felt that they had been slighted by Western powers during negotiations that concluded these conflicts. The trading privileges and territorial gains they obtained after defeating the Russians left many Japanese feeling discontented. They believed that their victory warranted greater rewards. During World War I, Japan allied with the Allies and effectively contained German naval forces in the Pacific and China. Though their contribution was relatively modest, Japan gained control of a handful of German territories in the Pacific. However, this was not satisfactory for many Japanese. The civilian government and the Western powers were primarily blamed for Japan's perceived lack of recognition. Numerous Japanese citizens were convinced that the Europeans, in particular, sought to suppress Japan's growth to a considerable extent. This notion held truth as a strong and proximate Japan could pose a threat to British, Dutch, French, and American colonies and commercial interests in Asia. The westernization of Japan's urban centers further fueled the grievances of many Japanese, particularly the conservative military. Western fashion, particularly for women, was becoming increasingly prevalent. As a result, many women began advocating for equal rights and expanded employment opportunities beyond domestic roles. Baseball and jazz music emerged as popular leisure activities in Japan, with baseball continuing to hold its appeal. Now, you might be asking, Why is the historical context crucial when discussing Japanese atrocities in World War II China? Well, it is essential to understand the underlying factors that contributed to these events. By the early 1930s, Japan has evolved into a military dictatorship, and throughout the 1930s and the first half of the 1940s, the nation developed into a fascist state, posing a threat to both its citizens and neighboring countries. The Japanese military government propagated ideas of ethnic supremacy, strict obedience, and loyalty to the emperor, and a modern interpretation of the samurai's guiding principles through media, education, and mass rallies. These principles including unwavering loyalty and a contempt for all things non-Japanese. The Bushido code they followed only nominally resembled the ways of the ancient samurai. The primary victims of Japanese ethnocentrism was the Chinese. Over the centuries, China had demanded and obtained various forms of tribute from Japan, resulting in Chinese culture significantly influencing Japan. Although Japanese culture eventually developed into its distinct identity, numerous religious beliefs, writing systems, and cultural features all had Chinese origins. By the 20th century, many Japanese perceived themselves as having outgrown and surpassed their cultural parents. Coupled with the aforementioned ideas, the Japanese in China exhibited behavior akin to that of Nazis in occupied Europe, considering themselves superior and showing no regard for non-Japanese lives. In 1931, the Japanese seized control of the Chinese region, Manchuria. They invaded China in 1936 and quickly captured a large portion of the eastern part of the country, particularly the coastal cities. The Chinese, who found themselves under Japanese occupation, faced appalling treatment marked by a series of brutal atrocities, with the notorious rape of Nanking in 1937 being the most infamous example. The Japanese economically exploited the Chinese under their rule. Furthermore, China became a massive testing ground for the Japanese military to research chemical and biological weapons. In addition to enduring modern warfare, the war led to the deaths of millions of Chinese people, including both military personnel and civilians. Estimates of Chinese casualties from 1936 to 1945 ranged between 10 and 20 million. Shiro Ishii, a doctor with a background similar to Mengele and Auschwitz, was instrumental in increasing this death toll. Born in 1892 into a well-to-do family, Ishii eventually became a doctor and joined the army as a surgeon in 1921. Fascinated by the process of infection, he visited World War I's battlefields in Europe and became interested in the potential of chemical and biological weaponry. After spending 2 years studying these battlefields and conversing with the doctors and officers who served there, Ishii emerged as an expert in the weapons of mass destruction. In 1936, Ishii was instructed to establish a new unit. Officially named No. 731 Water Purification Unit, it is commonly known as Unit 731. He was joined by several other doctors, including his deputy, Dr. Hisoto Yoshimura. The unit also included other medical professionals, guards, and assistants. Unit 731's headquarters was a former fortress and prison camp near the northern Chinese city of Harbin, capable of accommodating up to 1,000 people at any given time. Between its inception and the end of the war, Unit 731 was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 200 to 300,000 people. Most of these victims did not die from conventional execution methods such as firing squads or hangings. Unlike the Nazis who employed gas in their death camps in Poland, the majority of Unit 731's victims perished due to experiments devised by Ishii, Yoshimura, and their associates. These lethal experiments took various forms. It is believed that thousands of Chinese in nearby areas lost their lives when Unit 731 released a range of pathogens among the unsuspecting population. These included plague, typhus, smallpox, and prisoners were also injected with tuberculosis, cholera, gonorrhea, syphilis, and induced to suffer from dysentery. Flea bombs containing plague-ridden insects were unleashed in towns and villages. Children were fed food laced with deadly chemicals, and their bodies were subsequently dissected and analyzed. Overwhelming doses of tetanus vaccine, which caused unmanageable muscle spasms that frequently resulted in death, were administered within the prison. Medical professionals and soldiers occasionally donned protective suits. Outdoors, individuals wearing eerie biohazard suits would traverse areas scattered with deceased and dying people, not to provide assistance, but to evaluate the lethality, longevity, and efficacy of their biological weapons. Experiments also involve exposing victims to extreme level of X-rays. The radioactive burns inside and outside the body were studied after the subject succumbed to the exposure. Many individuals who were dying from disease inflicted by Unit 731 members underwent examinations before their deaths. By examinations, we mean that they were dissected in various ways and had body parts removed without anesthesia. Ishii and his team aimed to observe the infection process before significant internal and external infections occurred, believing that decomposition could alter or distort their findings. Some experiments, although they may have had theoretical purposes, appeared to have been devised out of sheer cruelty. Individuals were incinerated alive using flamethrowers and subjected to chemical warfare agents, which were either thrown onto bare skin or forced into their mouths and other body openings. Female prisoners experienced sexual assault, sometimes by male prisoners, with the stated intention of investigating the potential for conception despite being infected with lethal diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea. Numerous guards contracted infections from assaulting prisoners, even though they were officially prohibited from engaging in sexual contact with them. Similarly to Nazi physicians, Ishii and his colleagues exposed individuals to frigid temperatures and low-pressure chambers. They also induced heart attacks, forced abortions on prisoners and local women, and performed nightmarish surgeries such as amputating arms and attaching legs in their place, removing reproductive organs, and more. The list is virtually endless and features numerous other instances of cruelty, some of which, we warn you, are even more horrifying than what have been discussed in this video. Upon the war's conclusion in September of 1945, Ishii was in Japan. He and several of his associates were apprehended by the US authorities. Much like the number of sought-after Nazi war criminals, Ishii received immunity from prosecution. Indeed, the United States military government granted him immunity. The reason? The US believed that some of the data gathered by Ishii during the war could potentially be useful to America in future conflicts. Shockingly, Ishii passed away peacefully in 1959. Several of Ishii's subordinates and soldiers were apprehended by the Soviets as they invaded northern China in the final moments of the war. Astonishingly, they were given prison sentences instead of capital punishment, even though some of their sentences span over 20 years. In a Soviet attempt to enhance relations with Japan, all of them were sent back to Japan in the 1950s. Following the war, Unit 731 members openly organized reunions in Japan. We understand that it's difficult to enjoy a video with such content, but if you did find it informative, please share your support by liking and subscribing, and remember to click the bell so you'll be notified on our future engaging releases.